Could Singapore have more Teslas than Toyotas one day? This country has great public transportation, long-term urban planning. It's seen by some as the Wakanda of real-life Earth. Yet, in Singapore, we only have 3.8% EV adoption as percentage of new car sales, lagging far behind China and Europe, which are close to 20% this year. So in this video, I'm joined by Walter Theseira, who is an associate professor who actually specializes on urban transportation, to just talk a little bit more about EVs in Singapore, the mindsets. He's also a Tesla Model 3 owner himself. So click subscribe to stay updated to more videos on Tesla. Walter, what should the audience know about you?
Hi, I'm Walter Theseira. I'm an Associate Professor of Economics at the Singapore University of Social Sciences.
We're here inside Walter's Model 3 to ask him a couple of questions. To begin with, I'd like to hear what made you get an EV, Walter?
Well, it was a very practical decision because my old car's COE was expiring. So, if you're not a viewer from Singapore, that's a license that we need to have for our car. It lasts for about 10 years, and when it ends, it's pretty expensive to renew the license. So a lot of Singaporeans make the decision whether they want to keep their car or buy a new car at that point, right? So my old car's COE was expiring in 2021. I actually would have renewed the COE on it, but around the time it was expiring, I realized Tesla was opening direct sales in Singapore. So I took a look at the website, I took a look at the price that they were offering it at, and I had of course known about Tesla for some time before this, and I was surprised that it was actually fairly affordable as far as cars in Singapore go. It's not going to be affordable to most people around the world, but for Singapore, it was actually very well priced. I'll talk more about that later. So I made the decision then to actually, just not renew the COE of my old car and buy a Tesla instead. So that's pretty much when I made the decision. If I hadn't bought the Tesla, I would have renewed the COE on the car and probably kept my old car for another 5 or 6 years. I probably would have then bought an EV around maybe the mid-2020s, but not now, basically.
So Walter, this is your first EV that you own.
Yeah.
What sold you about the Model 3 specifically?
Well, the Model 3, I think, in Singapore actually represents really incredible value for money. Now, I know it's ridiculous to talk about value for money on a car that today with COE all in, it's probably around $200,000. There are cheaper EVs out there. There are cheaper cars out there. That's for sure, right? And I recognize that, spending $200,000 on a car is a lot of money. But I think in the Singapore market, you cannot get another car with the same balance of performance, comfort, capability as the Model 3 for about $200,000. It's simply not possible. If you think about what you can get, right? Look, for $200,000 in Singapore, you can buy a top-end Japanese or Korean car with COE. No problem with that. You can also buy an entry-level Continental, German car, for example. But none of these cars will actually give you the same balance of power, performance, efficiency, and comfort, I think, as the Model 3, and technology as well. Just give you one example, right, of how you should be thinking about this, I think. This car would have the performance capability of a fairly medium to high-end Continental car, but it's got the fuel efficiency, the energy efficiency, pretty much of a Toyota Prius. And I think finding that blend together is pretty much impossible in the market at the moment outside of Tesla. So that's why I said it's good value for money. It's an expensive car, but given that Singaporeans like to buy expensive cars, I think it's actually fairly competitive in that context.
One of the things that Teslas are known for are no-compromise vehicles. In the past, when you bought an EV, you felt you had a compromise on quality, the software, the range. So Teslas have transformed perceptions of EVs. But here in Singapore, we feel that we're still years behind. What would you say is the current perception of the general public of EVs?
Yeah, that's quite a complex question because and I think we need to unpack it a bit, because I think when you look worldwide, and including in Singapore, a lot of the public perception of EVs actually has to do with what EVs represent to the viewer rather than anything about EVs themselves. I mean, I'll give you a very good example, maybe not in the Singapore context, but if you look at the American context, right, a lot of EV owners there report that there's a certain amount of antipathy, maybe even hatred from some non-EV owners. But why is that? It's actually nothing to do with technology. It's because to some non-EV owners in the United States, EVs actually represent to them some kind of government overreach or political philosophy that they're opposed to, right? Why? Because EVs in the US are identified, for example, with climate change, right? They're identified with government efforts to try to combat or try to do something about climate change. And if you're an American who, politically speaking, doesn't believe in climate change, or you happen to believe that climate change, for example, is being used by the government as an excuse for unwanted intrusion into your lives, for unwanted, policy measures to reduce your ability to buy a non-EV, then of course you'll be quite angry when you see an EV, right? And that's why I think EV owners in the US sometimes get a lot of negative reactions, because the people who are looking at EVs are actually seeing EVs as representing a threat to their way of life rather than anything about the technology itself. So I think in Singapore, I think we're a bit less politically polarized than the United States. I think a lot of people simply don't have much knowledge about EVs rather than view them with any kind of political suspicion. So I think you've got a large group of consumers in Singapore who simply don't know much about EVs, right? They see an EV, they're kind of interested or intrigued, but they know very little about it. So I think that's, my guess is probably that's the largest group in Singapore. Then you've got another group of users or motorists, for example, who regard EVs with perhaps a bit of concern, right? Why are they concerned about EVs? Because everybody knows that EVs run on batteries, they run on high voltage battery systems, and they might be concerned about the safety risks that EVs pose. And this is also a view that a lot of motorists in other countries also have. So they fear that if they're involved in an accident with an EV, or they fear that if the EV is charging, then it may suddenly catch fire, right? Now, even though statistically speaking, EVs are actually safer in terms of fire risk than internal combustion engine vehicles, at least based on fire incidents. And even though, of course, all of us as former ICE drivers, we somehow don't think about the fact that we're sitting on a huge tank full of flammable fluid, right? I mean, people are concerned about EVs, and I think in the Singapore context, this is also partially motivated by the problem that another motorized vehicle which uses batteries, which would be PMDs, are well publicized in Singapore to have a lot of fire safety concerns. So I understand why people are concerned about the fire risk there. And then I think finally you have got definitely a group of Singaporeans who see EVs as representing for them many of the bad things about Singapore. So what do EVs represent? I mean, EVs represent inequality, for example, right? EVs represent the rather materialistic and classist nature of Singapore society. And this is not helped by the fact that a certain number of EV drivers, and indeed Tesla drivers among them, have gotten well publicized in the news for one reason or another for being inconsiderate drivers, inconsiderate people, and so on. So I think there is an element of that when you see an EV in Singapore, just like seeing, for example, a luxury car, you might associate that with certain things you don't like about Singapore society. And I think that's understandable because an EV is an expensive car, and certainly, I think if I wanted to really save the environment, I shouldn't have bought a car, right? I should have instead, walked around, cycled, or used the MRT or public transport. So there's a certain amount of hypocrisy to spending a huge amount of money on a battery electric vehicle and claiming that you're doing something to save the environment. I recognize all that, and I think for people who see that in EVs and EV owners, I understand why they would have a certain amount of antipathy, right, or even disgust or whatever. But it is what it is, and I think at least speaking for myself, I think if you're in a situation where having a car is the most practical solution for you for your transport needs and you can afford it, then buying an EV isn't, I think, a bad choice. And I think that's really how we should be thinking about EVs at the moment. They're not going to be the ideal solution, I think, to the climate crisis. They certainly can't solve all our political or social problems like inequality. But I think that if you are in a situation where a car is a good fit for your needs, an EV is probably better, I think, than an ICE car at this point. So that's where we are.
How much do you see the government's own policy shape or people's perceptions here? Years ago, our leadership used to say that EVs like this were a lifestyle product. That has changed.
Yeah, So I think to understand this a bit, I think we have to look at two competing policy objectives that the government has in Singapore, and indeed, I think many other cities where people are thinking about EV adoption. If you look at the context of a city like Singapore, the most important public policy, I think, for a sustainable transport future is to try to encourage people to give up their cars and adopt a car-light lifestyle. It doesn't mean that you're going to ban cars, of course, but I think what it means is you try to shift as many people as possible to taking public transport, like in Singapore, the bus and MRT, or even better, to not needing to use transport at all, or just using very short-range transport like walking, cycling, and so on, or even personal mobility devices. So I think that's the most important policy that any government in a city can actually take to try to deal with the climate crisis and sustainability. Then the other big policy you have in many places, like Singapore now, is to try to encourage the private vehicle fleet to electrify as far as possible, right? To adopt more sustainable, less polluting modes of transport, or at least motor types. And if you think about it, the problem is these two policies, right? Trying to encourage a car-light mindset or infrastructure, and trying to encourage the existing vehicle fleet or the new vehicle fleet to electrify. These two policies fundamentally conflict at some point. The reason why they conflict is one of the most convenient, one of the most popular ways to encourage electrification is to give out incentives, right? Is to give people tax incentives or other incentives to buy and use EVs. So lots of countries and lots of cities give tax incentives. Lots of places also allow EVs. They give EVs permission to use parts of the road infrastructure, like high occupancy lanes or toll lanes, for free or with additional perks, for example. So if you think about it, if you encourage people to buy EVs, if you give them money to buy EVs, that fundamentally conflicts with the first objective of trying to get people to actually not drive in the first place or to give up their cars. And that's actually the problem. So I think in Singapore's case, I think for a long time, the government felt that it would be quite problematic to actually directly incentivize or encourage people to buy EVs when, as I explained earlier, that actually conflicts with the first policy objective of trying to get people to give up their cars in the first place. So I think that's the first problem. Second problem, I think, is that it wasn't clear for a long time what the winning technology would actually be as far as sustainable transport goes. If you think about 10 years ago, what were people talking about? People were talking about battery electric vehicles, that's true, but people were also talking about hydrogen vehicles. People were talking a bit further back then about compressed natural gas vehicles. People were also talking about whether the right choice was between battery electric versus plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So there were a lot of competing technology choices, and the difference between Singapore and, let's say, a place like China, North America, the EU, or Japan is that Singapore has no domestic car industry. And that means that the choice the Singapore government makes in terms of incentives, in terms of policy to shape the landscape towards a certain direction, basically the Singapore government can't do anything to move the needle in terms of technology or manufacturing. Can't do a single thing. Whereas in the United States or in China, if you have a national EV policy, for example, you actually move the needle because you're actually incentivizing, encouraging the entire car industry in the country to move towards a certain objective. But that's not something that Singapore can do or can influence in any shape or form. Singapore is a very small car market as far as the global car market is concerned. And I think here, the Singapore government was also scarred, I think, to some extent, by an earlier policy push for an alternative fuel vehicle that ended up failing the market test, and that would be compressed natural gas vehicles. So I think older Singaporeans will remember that maybe more than about a decade or so ago, there was actually a bit of a push towards CNG vehicles. There were some tax incentives given out for CNG vehicles. And this was, of course, because compressed natural gas can be easily retrofitted to existing vehicles that use petrol. And the fuel is also a lot more emissions friendly. It's a lot less polluting than petrol or diesel are, certainly, right? But what happened? Basically, CNG as an alternative fuel source never really took off in Singapore, or indeed most of the markets. It turned out that a lot of the problems of infrastructure and distribution were too difficult to overcome, and even for the vehicles themselves, there ended up being too many compromises. You had to install a pretty large and bulky CNG tank, and if those tanks and the fuel systems were not well maintained, there was a big fire risk, and Singaporeans saw that a number of CNG vehicles actually did catch fire. So basically CNG was kind of a failed policy experiment, and my feeling is I think at least some policymakers in Singapore were a bit scarred by that and did not want to repeat that bad experience by pushing a new energy vehicle technology that would end up being a massive market failure. Where are we today? Today, when you look at battery electric vehicle technologies, I think it's quite clear that if you have a policy that supports BEV conversion of the light vehicle fleet, that's going to be betting on the winning horse. Why do I say that? Because essentially, BEVs today, plug-in battery electric vehicles, have pretty much won the technology and market race. Nobody, I think, thinks that seriously that hydrogen electric vehicles will actually be competitive within the next couple of years. As for between BEVs and plug-in electric vehicles, the rapidly declining cost of batteries actually means that BEVs are probably going to become much more competitive than plug-in hybrid electrics within a couple of years. And as for this, I think the only remaining policy question really is about battery electric vehicles which are plug-in versus battery swapping. I think that's the only major remaining policy question, and I think that is likely to be resolved in favor of just plug-in battery electric vehicles. The reason for that is that the infrastructure demands for plug-in electrics are just a lot lower, right, compared to having to build out a network of battery swapping stations. So I think it's pretty much only the Chinese market and only a couple of Chinese manufacturers who are still really trying to push large-scale battery swapping technology. For North America, for the EU, I think the winning technology quite clearly would be plug-in battery electric vehicles. So that's why I think seeing how the market is evolved, I think the Singapore government has felt that now is pretty much the right time to push battery electrification in a large way, and that's where we are right now.
So today, we are quite certain that the future is EVs. I think
At
even
least in the near term. Yeah.
most of the legacy automakers also agreed as well.
Yeah.
Toyota tried a long time in the Mirai with hydrogen. Many other car companies 10 years ago they made statements saying that EVs will always be a niche. Today, they're fully transitioning to EVs, whether it's BMW, Mercedes. In fact, in a recent BMW shareholders meeting, investors were telling them that you need to make the switch now before it becomes the next BlackBerry. So as we make this change towards EVs, one of the biggest pain points that many perceive is EV charging availability. In Singapore, we have roughly 3,000 EVs and 1,500 EV charging stations, public ones. That's a ratio of almost 2 to 1. The International Energy Agency recommends a ratio of 10 EVs to 1 charger. So our ratio is pretty good. It's one of the highest in the world, yet the perception that there isn't enough public EV chargers still persists here. What's behind that?
I think the basic reason why people think that it's going to be a huge problem charging their cars in Singapore is that most of the people considering buying an EV or who are looking at the market and looking at EVs actually have obviously never owned one before, because they've only become commercially successful in Singapore in pretty much the last year or so. And second, I think their most common experience with battery technology is actually their handphones, right? Or maybe their laptop. And if you look at your handphone or laptop, these are things that you need to plug in and charge pretty much every single day, right? Otherwise, you can't get much use out of them. So I think it's natural that when people think about their own consumer experiences with battery-powered technology, and you think about cars which are battery-powered, they might assume, oh, look, this is something that I need to plug in every day. If I don't plug it in fact, maybe even in the middle of the day, it's going to lose power and charge, and I won't be able to get what I need to get done with it, right? So I think it's natural for people to have this fear or apprehension. I think this is also not helped by the fact that the first generation of battery electric vehicles, because the technology constraints, because the cost constraints back then, they tended to be designed with fairly small batteries. Batteries which are only large enough for maybe about 1 or maybe 1.5 days of use in an urban setting. And so if that is what people's experience with BEVs are, or that is what people have heard about BEVs, for example, if you look at the blue car in Singapore, which is probably one of the more common touch points that Singaporeans have with EVs if they're not an EV owner, the blue car really only has enough range to get around town for a couple of days at most. I think it's about maybe 150 miles of range, if I'm not wrong, 200 kilometers plus of range. And if you're a blue car renter, you're told that the moment you return it, you have to plug it in. So of course, if you use a blue car, you might have the apprehension that if you own an EV yourself, that's what life is like. When you go from point A to point B, you have to immediately find somewhere to plug it in, and it's not going to last very long if you don't plug it in. So that's why I think people have got charging anxiety or range anxiety in Singapore. It's because everything they know about battery technology in EVs tells them if they don't plug it in continuously, they're going to be stranded, right? But of course, the reality is not so. If you own a current generation EV, it doesn't have to be a Tesla. It can be any of the modern EVs that are sold by, for example, Hyundai or BMW, Mercedes-Benz or whatever. All of these EVs have batteries which are large enough to last you easily half a week to a week in Singapore without charging, right? Without charging in between. And so if you think about charging from that mindset, actually I think you overcome a lot of these concerns. The other point I'd make, I think, is that it's not just important to have a certain vehicle to charging ratio. I think what's really important as well is where those chargers are located and how people can integrate charging for their EVs into their lifestyles or their daily lives as a matter of convenience rather than as a matter of necessity. And what I mean by that is, if you're thinking about buying an EV, for example, when I was thinking of buying this EV, the first thing I really had to do is I had to look at what was the charging network like around where I live, right? And I did find that there were a number of fast chargers near where I lived. So I happen to live in the kind of public housing in Singapore where I don't have access to my own privately owned charging point, which is the case, I think, for about 90% of Singaporeans. So, if you're like the 90% of Singaporeans who don't own in the kind of property where you own your own charging point, first thing you have to do is look at the charging network around you, figure out what are the alternatives around you, and what are your practical ways of charging. And for me, I was lucky. There were actually fast chargers pretty close to my house. Even though there weren't any AC charging point near my house, I thought that was okay, I could live with it, and it turns out that's perfectly fine, right? So for me, the way I get charging done is if I happen to be going somewhere with a slower charging point with AC charging, like a shopping mall or somewhere, and I'm going to be there a couple of hours, I try to plug in and top up my battery then. Okay, because then I'm getting charged as a convenience when I'm doing something else rather than having to worry about charging. And I do have to rely on faster charging, to top up the battery other than that, but it's not been too much of a problem. But I think that's the biggest obstacle, which is that if you're not an EV owner, you would actually find it hard to understand how to integrate charging into your daily life. I think that's the biggest pain point probably. And you might have this misapprehension that what you will end up doing is driving to the charging point or the petrol station, because a lot of petrol stations now have charging points, and you might have the fear that what you'll end up doing with an EV is spending every day 3 or 4 hours of your life there. But that's not true, right? With a modern EV, that's totally untrue, and I think for most EV owners who don't have charging at home, you get charging done as part of your life. And maybe on those occasions where you can't integrate it into your errands and so on, you might have to take a couple of minutes, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, 20 minutes out of your schedule to go and charge. But even so, when you're getting your charging done, you might integrate it with something else, because a lot of the faster charging points are at malls anyway, and you can go and do your grocery shopping or pay your bills or go to the bathroom, whatever, while you're doing that. So I think it works. But I understand why people have this apprehension or fear. Yeah.
In most countries, big part of the population stays in landed property. Install your home charger, Gaoting. Here in Singapore, it's kind of like Hong Kong. Hong Kong has 20,000 EVs, 80% of them, 15,000 are Teslas. And they found a way to make it work like Singapore. And as we think about the future, more and more people want to get EV, but then they still have this concern, as you mentioned. So if someone asks, Walter, I need to renew my car. I'm driving an ICE car right now. I need to change my car next year. Should I wait? Should I wait for one more generation, like another 10-year cycle, before I get an EV? What's your take?
Yeah, so I think that's a kind of a tough decision to make, and I also struggle with the same decision because I mean the fact is the technology is moving so rapidly now that any EV you buy will be outclassed by an EV you can buy in about 3 to 4 years time. I'm pretty sure of that. I mean, if you think about this Tesla that I own, the current generation of Teslas coming out, just 1 year later, they already have for my model, there's already 10% better battery capacity. There's more efficiency. There's some technology upgrade. So we're in a market right now where things are moving very quickly. And of course, there's no contest, I think, between EVs that you can buy today and the EVs you could have bought 5 years ago. It's pretty much one generation in terms of technology. So it is a difficult decision to make. But that being said, I would actually encourage the potential EV buyer to think about a different problem instead, right? And the different problem is, what kind of an upgrade are you going to get over your current ICE vehicle or even a new ICE vehicle versus buying a current gen EV? And I think the difference is actually just massive. I think for somebody who has not owned an EV before or driven one before, it's going to be hard to appreciate this point, especially if your only experience of EVs might be actually a last gen EV, which was simply not competitive with current ICE vehicles or EVs. But I'd say that if you're getting into a modern EV, whether it's from Tesla, Hyundai, or BMW, Mercedes-Benz, whoever, right? What you're getting into is a vehicle that simply does everything your conventional ICE car does, but better. That's actually the key point here. Why do I say better? Because many of the pain points people have about owning a conventional vehicle. I mean, emissions aside, you've got, for example, the noise from the engine, the maintenance required, things like that, the efficiency, the fuel costs. All of these pain points actually go away with a modern EV because the modern EV is by design actually more powerful, more capable, more convenient to use than a conventional ICE car is. Is it cheaper? No, it's not cheaper at the moment. So I think cost is certainly a factor. I think if you wanted to save money as well as save the environment, you're probably much better off keeping your current car, right, until it really falls apart, or maybe buying a used Toyota Prius. So I want to be quite clear about that. Those are probably cheaper, more environmentally friendly alternatives. But if you're in the market for a new car, you can afford it, you want to treat yourself maybe to a little bit of an upgrade, then I think an EV is actually an excellent choice. And I think, the way to think about it is, it's going to be a big upgrade over your current ICE car. If you wait longer, of course, they're going to get even better, but think about whether you want that upgrade right now. I think that's basically how I would look at it.
That's a good reframe. To not just think of buying an EV, but just think of, I want a better car. And often, the better car would be an EV by itself, I think. Example at Tesla, the software is amazing. Some Tesla owners say we get more software updates on a Tesla than on our iPhones. Yet, with all the marvels that EVs have, there are only under 4,000 EVs in Singapore. The vast majority of Singaporeans will not personally experience an EV. So if we want to shift mindsets, we want to get broad public support for EVs. What can the government do? Example, like maybe transition the entire ride-hailing and taxi fleet or bus fleet to EVs. What's one thing that we can really do to shift mindsets here?
Yeah, so I think as far as government policy is concerned, there are plans in place to transition the public vehicle fleet over, and this would be public buses, taxis, and so on over to EVs, or at least less polluting alternatives as soon as possible. But I don't think that transition is necessarily about shifting public mindsets towards EVs, and I don't necessarily think that the government needs to actually do anything to convince Singaporean motorists that EVs are actually better. And the reason why I say that is, I really think we should think about this the same way as we think about whether we should convince people that bicycles are a faster way of getting to where you're going to go than walking, or whether you want to convince people that the early cars are going to be better than horses. Okay, I mean, the reason why I'm saying all this is that, frankly speaking, I think any objective person who gets into a modern EV and compares that to a similar price point modern ICE will feel that there is really no comparison that can be made. The EV is actually objectively better on a lot of the criteria that people care about, power, noise, refinement, capability. Modern, well-designed EVs are actually better than ICE, right? This is not something you could have said 10 years ago. I want to be quite clear about that. And I think part of the problem is a lot of people have impressions of EVs based on the EV technology which is available one generation ago. And the early EVs were crippled by the high cost of the batteries, and also I think by the designer's mindset, right? What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about Tesla versus the competition, I think the basic difference between Tesla and everybody else is not that they have superior technology or anything like that. It's that they set out with the mindset of making a car that was simply better, right? And used electrification as a means to make it better. Whereas many of the other designers of EVs about 10 years ago were stuck in the mindset that what they had to make was an eco-friendly car, right? And of course, the underlying final objective is to have more sustainable transport. I get that. But you're not going to get there by making cars which only die-hard environmentalists want to buy and own. You're just not going to get there. That's the problem, you see? You are going to get there, however, by making cars which do everything regular people expect from their cars, but do them better. And that's where we are with electrification today. I think all major car manufacturers, as you suggested earlier, have come around to realize that EVs are a technology platform that allow them to do everything a car does, but simply better, right? And hopefully in a couple of years also at lower cost. And I think that's the point where we truly see a market shift. I say that because when you look at some of those markets you mentioned earlier, like the European Union, for example, or China, where electrification as a percentage of new vehicle sales is actually pretty considerable. In some of the sub-markets there, for example, I think in Norway, it's actually more than 50%, right? And what those markets show you is that once EVs achieve price parity with comparable ICE cars, whether that's through just reduction in manufacturing costs or whether that's through tax incentives, once you get to the price parity point, the consumers actually vote with their wallet. They buy EVs because at the same price point, generally speaking, EVs are much more compelling propositions than ICE. And that's why I think in Singapore, we don't need to do anything to shift mindsets. Once the costs come down enough, once people get familiar enough with EVs or they experience more of them, they're going to find that the EV is actually much better value for money for them than ICE cars are. I certainly think that if you're in the market for about the around maybe $200,000 price range in Singapore, an EV is probably much more compelling than a lot of the ICE cars you can buy there, for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So yeah, is it an everyday affordable car for people yet? No, it's not because of the high cost of batteries, but I'm pretty confident that by the middle of the decade, it will get to that point. And in fact, even in Singapore today, if you're willing to consider, for example, a Chinese-made EV or a Chinese EV, I should say not Chinese-made because this car I'm sitting in is, of course, Chinese-made. It's made by the Tesla factory in Shanghai. But if you're willing to consider a Chinese-branded EV, there are actually a lot of very affordable options out there. And in fact, in terms of EV technology, the Chinese are one of the technology leaders in the market, right? So that's why I think that offers a real potential for Singaporeans to get into EVs at a much more affordable price point.
To build on Walter's point, for a brand like Tesla specifically, I don't think they're going for price parity, but they're going for value parity. Your iPhone or your Samsung phone costs 3 to 4 times more than the old Nokia 3310s you bought. But it's value parity because it's your camera, it's your compass, it's your Game Boy, multiple devices which if you bought separately would have cost more than just buying one single smartphone. If a Tesla can one day activate limited robotaxis, full self-driving betas here in Singapore, the car could cost 20% more, but deliver 50% more value. The change is coming, and Singapore's government has said that they're going to phase out the sale of pure new ICE cars by 2030. Is this too fast, too slow, just right? What's your take?
Well, I think So I think the way to think about this problem is that Singapore again has got no ability to shift the global vehicle market, right? Because we're not a large car making country and we're also not a very large car market as far as these things go globally. So our plans, I think, are pretty much just aligned with the plans that major car manufacturing countries have to try to phase out ICE vehicles within the next decade plus or so. So if you look at major markets in the EU, if you look at China, all of these places have announced plans which are on a similar time frame, right? And in responding to these plans, the major car manufacturers globally have also generally announced that they plan to sunset R&D of ICE vehicles. So what does it mean? It means that all of the best scientists, engineers, technicians are going to be working on EVs from this point onwards. And what that means for the Singapore consumer is that by the end of the decade, it's very likely the only ICE vehicles that you can buy, even if there was no government policy to phase out. It's very likely that the only ICE vehicles you can buy in Singapore by the end of the decade are models that the large car manufacturers have already sunset and are only producing for developing country markets. That's the reality, right? So I think for a Singaporean thinking about this policy and thinking, why is the government being so radical? Why is the government forcing us to buy EVs? What I'm trying to say here is that without any Singapore government policy in this regard, you would find that the most desirable, the best engineered, the most technology-laden vehicles in the Singapore market by the end of the decade would be EVs anyway. You want to buy an ICE? Sure, you can go ahead and buy an ICE, but what you will be buying is a car that is made, quite frankly, for the Indonesian market or the Malaysian market, for a more developing country market, rather than the Philippines market. That's what you'll be buying. And if you want to do that, go ahead, more power to you, but I don't think that that is what the majority of Singapore consumers want. Cars are expensive in Singapore, but Singaporeans also have very high expectations for their cars. And what the market here shows is Singaporeans tend to want to buy the latest and greatest. And that's why I think even without a Singapore government policy to sunset EVs, everybody is going to be buying EVs by the end of the decade in Singapore. Simply because that will be the car that meets your car needs, right, the best.
Walter, thank you so much for your great
Sure.
perspectives. I've learned so much hearing from your point of view. Thank you for being here on a Monday morning. And think about it, this whole interview on a rainy day in a car with the aircon on, it's only possible on the EV. You probably wouldn't do this in a nice car. So if you found this interview insightful, please click the like button. Hit subscribe to stay updated to more interviews like this. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.